Okay, greetings and salutations. Going to dispense with the formalities and cover that last section of chapter 19, dealing with climate disruption, of which you guys know we've had that conversation about it, okay? We have talked about the idea of rapid atmospheric warming could have serious consequences. What's going on? If there's a rapid increase in the average temperature of the lower atmosphere during this past century, what are the possible consequences for this? A possible sea level rise of 15 to 20% larger than the global average in the tropical areas. Possible global temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 Fahrenheit. Now that may not sound like much, but the reality is that can have a major impact on things. When you have an increased temperature like that, more ice and snow are more likely to melt. Now this can also impact weather patterns. Permafrost is likely to melt, for example. Possible consequences of the permafrost likely to be melting is releasing extra CO2 and CH4 into the atmosphere and thus speeding up the climate change as a result. This is a pretty major issue there as well. Okay? Now, with the permafrost that likely to melt, it's not guaranteed, okay, but likely to melt, the microbes become active. Plant roots can penetrate further down, resulting in the production of more CO2. The amount of methane generated depends on how saturated the ground is. The more saturated, the deeper that the plant roots can go down, generate more CO2 because the microbes will become more and more active. Methane is actually more climate changing than CO2. And the reason for that, it can hold on to the solar radiation longer than the CO2. However, it does stay less time in the atmosphere. But there's more CO2 in the atmosphere as opposed to the methane. Now, another consequence we looked at was sea levels rising. In 2007, the IPCC estimates by the end of the century sea levels rise by half a meter or 20 inches. Now this is going to cost us losing at least a third of coastal wetlands, estuaries, deltas where rice is grown. Now here's the thing, if rice is being grown and we lose that, now you got a food shortage, okay? That can be a problem. The saltwater contaminating the coastal freshwater aquifer. That's another thing. If people are getting their water from wells under the ground, if the salt water goes in there and mixes with that fresh water, because the sea levels are rising, that makes it more difficult for people to find drinking water on the coasts, okay? Low-lying islands would submerge under the water. This is, you know, another issue. Now, if we look at the East Coast and the South here, in terms of vulnerability to sea levels rise, and you can see all along Louisiana, Alabama there, it's very likely that if the ocean levels were to rise, you're going to lose a certain amount of land. Certainly New Orleans is going to be an issue there because of the sea level rise. Virginia Beach, Miami, okay, Charleston, South Carolina, those are pretty likely. That's going to be displacing a lot of people. Okay? Now understand that when we're looking at those sea levels rising, this is not something that it's like here today, and everything's okay today, and tomorrow the sea level has risen this high. It's not. This is going to be a process that's going to take conceivably months, okay? Possibly years. Would there be time to react to it? Yeah, I think so. Let's move on. Now, the other thing we talked about was oceans absorbing CO2 to form more carbonic acid, H2CO3. The levels of acid have gone up 30% since 1800 and could be at dangerous levels by 2050. That's what they claim. Now, it's true that the ocean's water does absorb CO2. We just don't know how long it's going to hold on to it. We don't know how much, except if the temperature of the oceans gets higher, if the oceans get warmer, they actually absorb less CO2. Excuse me, so more of it could be released to the atmosphere. Affecting coral, snails, oysters, organisms that have a shell, anything that's got calcium carbonate, that carbonic acid is going to react with the calcium carbonate and damage it, which makes it extremely difficult for coral to be able to repair itself. We talk about affecting phytoplankton populations which affect the food webs. This could possibly collapse. And this is a reference to a movie called Soylent Green, which was done in the 1970s. Okay? So it's kind of funny, it was done in the 1970s, and here we are almost at the year 2022. Okay? But the conditions were that the Earth underwent climate change, and their food was scarce, prices were ridiculously high, people were eating something called Soylent Green, and they were harvesting it from the phytoplankton in the oceans. Hence, this product right here, delicious Soylent Green. Now, I don't want to give away the movie. There is more to the story. Okay? If you're that interested, you can check it out. Now, other consequences, drought. Severe drought is more likely to be common. Now, remember, drought, evaporation, is greater than precipitation due to higher temperatures over a prolonged period of time. This is what we are experiencing in California. Now, this past rainy season, the 2018-2019 rainy season, it has been a blessing that we've had more water where they say we're out of the drought. I would be careful about saying something like that. I honestly believe we could use more rainfall. We could. And really, truly replenish the aquifers that we have. Okay? Now, there are scientists who believe that higher temperatures make water evaporate faster into the atmosphere. If you have more water in the atmosphere, you have more of a warming effect. Well, if you are here in Southern California, which is where I am, okay, if you go to places like Florida, or you go back east, say like Boston, all right, or even Chicago, where, excuse me, it's humid. And I mean very, very humid. You got a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, and it is warmer. Now, the problem about this is that droughts become more worse, and they become more widespread. The other problem is, if you've got more droughts, then the likelihood of forest fires goes up. I gotta check my timing here, doing great. That's a problem, because if you've got more forest fires, you have got more warming of the atmosphere because of the CO2 being released. That's not counting all the soot particles from the ashes of the vegetation being burned. Now, the other aspect about the drought is farmers tapping even more into underground water supplies, which drops the level, the water table, and that makes it even harder, okay? And that's where you get a positive feedback loop on this. This is what they were projecting as far as changes in agriculture based on climate change. This is what they project. So here in the equatorial areas, they expect more drought, and as a result, there is an overall decrease in terms of agricultural yields. And even to the south of it, okay, you might see some slight changes in the positive, but mostly what's happening is that north of the equator, further north, where it's a lot colder at this point, you're supposed to get some agricultural changes. In other words, between 2003 and the 2080s, we should be seeing more agricultural yields in this area, which would be interesting. Now, part of it also is because of the global climate disruption or global climate change, okay, there's also more flooding, hurricanes, and storms in certain parts of the world. Now, they have made projections about there would be, every year, there would be an increasing number of hurricanes. we have the facts. That's not true. It varies. It actually varies because the Earth is very dynamic. Now the IPCC, okay, the International Panel for Climate Change, also states that biodiversity would go down in areas on every continent. Remember, biodiversity is how many species of like plants and animals that you have. Okay, so looking at the Amazon rainforest, you could probably be looking at a devastation. Because in the Amazon rainforest, where you have those luscious trees and the animals, if you're losing those ecosystem services, okay, and the rainforest will change, instead of becoming a tropical rainforest, it ends up becoming a tropical savanna, okay, like what you are seeing in Africa at that point. I'm not doing the Lion King. I'm not. Now, the biggest impact of the biodiversity loss is on polar bears, penguins, and plant life in the cold Arctic and the Antarctic. Now, again, plant life is also included in this, okay? That these guys, okay, they don't coexist in real life. They're on opposite ends of the world. But I love this picture, okay? That's bravery. That's courage right there in the animal world, okay? But yeah, losing biodiversity in terms of polar bears, penguins, plant life, absolutely. Now, some of the animals have been able to actually cooperate. They've been able to go and change, adapt, if you will, by migrating to new ranges. So, an example, the golden-winged warbler moved to the north. Okay, it just did. To avoid climate change. The North American pika, isn't this guy cute? Doesn't he look like a subject of a cartoon? Now, he moved to the northern mountain ranges from the Yosemite National Park. Now, the pika is still in the mountain ranges, but it has shifted to the north of Yosemite. So their range has changed. And they're changing because their argument is that it is a climate change on this. Now, if these animals are able to sense something, okay, why are they moving to the north? Possibly to avoid the conditions of the climate warming up. But the concern that they have is not all mammals, I should say, / animals, are able to make the move fast enough. How many are able to go and make the switch from one range to another? Because as you know, with basic ecology, if you're going from one territory to another, now you may have some competition. The dynamics will have altered. What's going to happen to species survival? What's going to happen in those areas? Those are questions that come up, but there's no way for us to be able to answer. At most, we're able to just guess. Now, other problems for mankind. Food production could face an overall decline because climate disruption threatens human health and economies. You got more bacteria, more mold, heat-related deaths. Should also look at mosquitoes. More mosquitoes in areas, mosquito-borne diseases. Okay? So you have that as well. So, to conclude this here is how do we slow it down? Can we stop it? How do we slow it down? And I want to spend a few minutes on that. Cutting down fossil fuel use, especially coal. Remember, it's putting out sulfates and mercury out there. Shifting from coal to natural gas. Improve energy efficiency. Sure. Shift to renewable energy resources. We've talked about that. Transfer energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies to developing countries. Yeah. Reduce deforestation. Use more sustainable agriculture and forestry. This is going back to things like selective cutting, using plantation in terms of growing trees so that if we need the lumber. Put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. But part of the problem is that when things die out in the wild, they also put out greenhouse gas. How do you put a price on that? I'm just saying, reduce poverty, slow population growth. You know, the reality is if you took the world's population and if you gave each person like an acre of land or something like that, they would fit in the size of the state of Texas. Seriously. Just a thought. Cleanup, removing carbon dioxide from smokestack and vehicle emissions. Store or sequester CO2 by planting trees. Again, when trees die, guess what? They give that up when they decay. Sequester CO2 in the soil by using no-till cultivation, taking cropland out of production. Sequester CO2 deep underground with no leaks allowed. Sequester CO2 in the deep ocean with no leaks allowed. Repair leaky natural gas pipelines and facilities. Use animal feeds that reduce CH4 emissions from cows. Belching. So if we cut down on the belching of cows, we're going to be able to save the planet. Some of these are fairly doable. Repairing leaky natural gas pipelines and facilities. Well, that's a maintenance thing. That shouldn't be a big idea. Reducing poverty. You know what? Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. That's just the way it was. Okay? But you know what? In spite of all this, we need to be good stewards because God did put us on this planet. He made it, we're on it, and we have a responsibility to take care of it. We can use it. We can use it sustainably. All right. That's it, guys. Enjoy.